Elena Briggs' morning began like any other quiet routine, and far from remarkable. The sun was still a few hours from peeking through the coastal fog, leaving the world in a hazy gray wash. The air had the familiar sting of salt from the bay, mixing with the sharpness of diesel from passing trucks. She sat behind the wheel of her old Honda, its engine sputtering twice before settling into the rhythmic hum of a car that had seen better days. The dashboard was cluttered with crumpled receipts, a half-drunk bottle of water, and a faded parking pass stuck in the corner of the windshield. She glanced at the broken parking meter near the courthouse, its display flickering intermittently between random digits and the word expired. A handwritten sign taped to the post read exact change only, a small reminder of how things were always just slightly off. Elena sighed, glancing at the sky as a few seagulls wheeled overhead, their calls cutting through the damp silence. This was her fourth visit to a government office in as many months. First the VA, then the county assessor's office, now here. The thought of it all made her tired, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. There was a part of her that wished things were different, that the endless errands weren't her life now. But there was no point in dreaming. She knew better than that. Her mind wandered briefly to the old shipping container she now called home, a small structure on a friend's property tucked away from the world. A life of solitude, quiet, and most importantly, safety. Elena wasn't one to ask for much, she just wanted peace, away from the noise of everything else. A small flicker of longing crossed her face as she turned the key in the ignition, her Honda's engine roaring to life. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty, save for a few cars that looked as tired as hers. The building itself stood in stark contrast to the gray morning around it, a concrete structure that looked as though it had been there for decades, untouched by time. Elena parked her car near the entrance, noticing the familiar smell of floor wax and stale coffee seeping out as she pushed the door open. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting everything in an eerie greenish hue that made her feel out of place. She moved through the lobby with the same quiet composure that had carried her through so many other mornings. No fanfare, no rush. As she approached the counter, the clerk, Mrs. Patterson, didn't even look up from her stack of paperwork. It wasn't the first time. Elena placed the manila envelope in front of her, a crumpled stack of forms that should have been simple to file, but had somehow turned into an endless bureaucratic mess. The VA's paperwork, her disability review, and now a missed court date. Elena couldn't help but think about how much of her life had been swallowed by forms and stamps, an endless cycle of proving she existed when it felt like the world had already forgotten her. When Mrs. Patterson finally looked up, there was a flicker of judgment in her eyes, nothing overt, but enough to make Elena feel like she didn't belong. Her worn clothes, faded Levi's and scuffed shoes, screamed struggler, while the others in the lobby likely looked like they had their lives together. Elena didn't mind. She didn't need to impress anyone here. Her life wasn't meant for the spotlight. Mrs. Patterson's words came out quickly, mechanical. Elena Briggs, you missed your court date. The judge issued a bench warrant. Elena blinked, taking a moment to process. A bench warrant for a parking citation. A slight pang of disbelief shot through her, but she kept her face blank. She hadn't even received notice of the court date. It was just another mess in a series of errors that seemed to follow her wherever she went. A moment of quiet passed before the clerk gestured toward the side hallway, where a Sergeant Mike Kowalski emerged with a smug air about him. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them as Kowalski's boots echoed through the lobby. Elena Briggs, he announced, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who had no room for explanation. You're coming with me. The words didn't register at first. Elena didn't flinch, didn't react. Even as her mind scrambled to understand what was happening, she stood still, like she'd been trained to do so many years ago in far different circumstances. He moved closer, and without another word, placed his hands on her arms, cold metal cuffs clicking into place. The sound was sharp, loud, jarring in the quiet lobby. For a moment, Elena stood there, her hands behind her back, her eyes scanning the room, noting how the others in the lobby began to stare. She knew what they were thinking. It wasn't the first time she'd been looked at like this, and it wouldn't be the last. Just another person caught in the system, treated like a criminal because of a small error, something that couldn't be fixed with a simple conversation. But she didn't argue. She didn't explain. As Kowalski led her away, Elena felt the weight of it all, the years of service, the sacrifices, the quiet heroism that no one had ever known. But here, in this cold, gray courthouse, she was just another defendant, another cog in a machine that didn't care about the person behind the case. It was the kind of day that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. Just another ordinary moment in a life that felt like it had been written by someone else. Elena stepped into the courthouse, her boots clicking softly against the tile floor, a sound that seemed almost too loud in the quiet, sterile space. The air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant, and the hum of fluorescent lights above added to the feeling of artificiality that pervaded the building. She moved through the lobby, passing the faded posters on the walls, their edges curling from years of neglect. A few people sat in hard plastic chairs, waiting their turn. Their eyes glazed over from the monotony of the process. It was just another day in a system that felt like it never quite saw her. Approaching the counter, she placed the manila envelope on the desk, the worn paper creased from countless handling. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a bored expression, didn't look up. Her fingers tapped lazily on the keyboard, the dull clack echoing in the silence between them. Elena stood still, hands resting lightly on the counter, waiting for the woman to acknowledge her presence. She didn't rush. She knew the drill. Her mind wandered for a brief moment to the last time she'd been here weeks ago, when the same indifferent attitude had greeted her. After a few long moments, the clerk finally glanced up, her gaze flicking over Elena before returning to her screen. "Yes," she asked, as though it were an inconvenience to even acknowledge her. Elena exhaled softly, the frustration beginning to bubble up, though she kept her voice even. "I'm here to resolve a parking ticket. I missed the court date, but I didn't receive any notification about it," Elena explained, her words measured and calm. The clerk didn't respond immediately, her fingers moving over the keyboard as if Elena's words hadn't even registered. The silence stretched, and Elena could feel the knot tightening in her stomach. "You were served at your address of record," the clerk finally said, her tone flat, barely looking at the screen. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly as she fought the urge to argue, to explain the mix-up with the address change and how she'd been dealing with the VA's endless paperwork. Instead, she chose her words carefully, choosing not to escalate things further. "I changed my address with the VA, but I never got the court notice," Elena said, her voice low, more to herself than to the woman behind the counter. She wanted to continue, to tell her about the countless hours spent on hold with bureaucrats who didn't care about her, but she didn't. She could feel the weight of the woman's indifference pressing down on her, making her words stick in her throat. The clerk shrugged as if Elena's explanation meant nothing. "You need to talk to the bailiff about resolving the warrant," she said curtly, turning her back to Elena as she started rifling through a pile of paperwork. The dismissiveness was a slap in the face, and Elena's heart quickened, her frustration simmering just below the surface. She had tried to be calm, but the system was relentless, mechanical, indifferent. As she turned to leave, Elena saw the bailiff approaching from the side. Sergeant Kowalski's heavy footsteps echoed across the linoleum floor, and Elena felt a chill run through her as he approached. His posture was rigid, and his face was set in a stern, practiced expression that made him seem like a man accustomed to authority. He didn't look at her as he addressed the clerk, his voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Elena Briggs," Kowalski's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. "You're coming with me." Elena froze for a moment, her mind racing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she didn't move. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their judgment heavy, even if none of them knew the full story. The clerk barely spared her a glance as she finished her task, indifferent to the drama unfolding. Kowalski stepped forward, his boots thudding against the tile with each step. "Failure to appear means you get processed first," he continued, his voice dripping with an authority that made Elena bristle. "Paperwork second." The words were cold, harsh, as if she were just another defendant to be dealt with, another inconvenience in a system that didn't care about her. Elena could feel her chest tightening, the weight of the past few months crashing down on her. But she didn't argue. She didn't try to explain herself again. Instead, she simply turned, placing her hands behind her back as he clicked the handcuffs into place. The sound of metal against metal was sharp, jarring, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. The people in the lobby watched, their eyes curious or judgmental. As Kowalski guided Elena toward the hallway, she could hear whispers behind her, hushed tones from the few people who had been paying attention. A woman in the back muttered under her breath about how Elena should have just paid the ticket online, her words thinly veiled with disdain. Another voice, older and gruff, added, "You think you can just ignore the courts?" Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She never did. She had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. She had been through too much in her life to let this moment get to her. But that didn't stop the frustration from rising inside her as she was led down the cold, sterile hallway. each step making her feel more and more like a ghost in a world that didn't care about the truth. It was just another day, another encounter with a system that didn't see her, that didn't understand her. The courthouse walls seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, and Elena couldn't help but feel like she was disappearing into the machinery. Just another faceless person caught in the gears of bureaucracy. The moment Sergeant Kowalski placed his hand on her arm, Elena felt the cold metal of the handcuffs tighten around her wrists. The sound of the clasp snapping into place echoed in the quiet hallway, a sound that felt louder than it should have been, as if it was the loudest thing in the world. She didn't resist, didn't try to pull away, even though every part of her body screamed in protest. She could feel the eyes of the other people in the lobby boring into her back, their judgment palpable, their whispers rising like a wave behind her. "You're coming with me," Kowalski said, his voice firm, almost rehearsed. The words were mechanical, a part of a routine he had likely repeated 100 times. He didn't look at her. Not really. Elena wasn't a person to him. She was just another name on a list, just another defendant to be processed. It was as if he had no idea who she was, what she had done, or what she had been through. She wasn't even a human being to him, she was just a problem to solve. As he led her through the hallways, Elena's mind raced, but her body stayed still. She knew the rules of engagement here. She had learned long ago that fighting back, resisting, only made things worse. Her entire military training echoed in her mind, a quiet whisper urging her to remain composed. "Stay calm," she reminded herself, even as her heart hammered in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, casting a sickly, yellow glow that seemed to make everything feel more oppressive. She caught glimpses of the other people in the hallway, some sitting in small groups, others standing in line. Their eyes darted over her, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. One woman glanced at her with a quick, dismissive look before returning to her phone. Another man, older and grizzled, shook his head slightly and muttered something about people thinking they can get away with everything. The words weren't meant for her, but they felt like a blow anyway. Elena's skin prickled, a flush of humiliation spreading from the tips of her ears down her neck. She wanted to tell them, to explain that this was a mistake, that she didn't deserve to be here. But the words never came. Instead, she clenched her jaw tighter, forcing herself to stay silent. They reached the holding area, a small, cold room with gray, chipped walls. There were no windows, just a bench bolted to the floor with a clipboard attached to the wall, the kind of place where time seemed to stop. Elena sat down slowly, her back straight and her hands resting in her lap. Still shackled together, the cool metal of the handcuffs burned against her skin, a constant reminder of how easily she had been reduced to nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the law. It didn't matter that she had served her country, that she had risked her life for the very people who now looked at her like she was nothing. Here, she was just a mistake, just another person caught in a system that didn't care about the truth. As she sat there, her mind replayed the events leading up to this moment. The parking ticket, the missed court date, the clerk who had brushed her off like a nuisance. All of it was an accumulation of small errors, of systems failing her at every turn. The VA, the housing office, the court, they were all the same. An endless cycle of red tape that no one cared enough to fix. And now, here she was, handcuffed and humiliated, treated like a criminal when all she had done was try to live quietly, to survive. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to be here. Elena could hear footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of shoes against the linoleum. The sound of the metal door opening brought her back to the present. A guard stood in the doorway, his face impassive. He wasn't here to offer an apology, to tell her it was all a mistake. He was here to do his job, to keep the system moving forward. Elena gave him a nod, as if acknowledging the inevitability of it all. She had no choice but to let it happen, to wait for the next step in the process. Outside, the sound of voices drifted in from the lobby. She could hear snippets of conversations, a distant laughter from a group of jurors, the click of a pen as someone filled out paperwork. The noise seemed so far away, like another world, a world that had nothing to do with her. She could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to loosen, though she refused to let herself relax completely. This wasn't over. Not yet. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Her mind kept drifting back to her training, to the countless missions she had been on. The missions where staying calm under pressure was not just important. It was life or death, but this wasn't a battlefield. There was no enemy to fight here, no clear mission. Here, in the cold confines of the holding room, her battle was with a system that had lost its humanity. Her training didn't apply. Her past didn't matter. The door creaked open again, and this time, a different face appeared, a man in a suit. His tie slightly askew, his hair too neatly combed. He held a clipboard, and his gaze flicked over her without any real interest. He was here to process her, to make sure the paperwork was done, to check off the boxes. He didn't care about her past or her story. Elena wasn't a person to him. She was just a case number. The guard at the door took a step forward and uncuffed her hands. The cold, oppressive metal was finally removed from her wrists, but the feeling of shame and frustration remained. Elena stood, her knees slightly stiff from sitting too long, and followed the man out of the holding room. She moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her shoulders squared and her head held high. She wasn't sure what was worse, the way they saw her or the way she saw herself. Now, she had been reduced to something less than a person in the eyes of the system, but she wouldn't let it break her. Not yet. The walk down the hallway felt long, each step making her feel smaller, more invisible. The heavy thud of her boots on the tile floor echoed in her ears as she passed. The other defendants, all of them trapped in their own quiet battles. Some were looking at her now, noticing her, wondering why she had been cuffed, why she had been treated like this. Elena could feel their eyes on her back, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She was no longer the woman she used to be. She had been made small in the eyes of the world, but she would keep walking. Elena's sleeve slipped slightly as Sergeant Kowalski guided her down the narrow courthouse hallway. It was an insignificant movement, but in that instant, her past, her true identity was revealed to the world. The small, faded marks on her forearm were exposed to the light for the first time in years. 9 tiny parallel lines burned into her skin, each one a marker of lives taken, memories buried deep beneath the surface. They weren't tattoos, nor were they reminders of a carefree youth. These marks were her history, her truth, and the world wasn't ready to know it. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, seated at the back of the room with her colleague, looked up as Elena passed by. Her eyes immediately locked onto the marks on Elena's arm, her trained mind quickly recognizing them. Walsh's breath caught in her throat, her hand hovering over the phone she had been scrolling through absent-mindedly. She knew exactly what those marks meant. Elena wasn't just another defendant with a parking ticket. Elena Briggs was someone else entirely. Someone who had been buried in the shadows of a life few could ever imagine. The entire room seemed to pause, the dull murmur of voices quieting for just a split second. Walsh's face went pale as she stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She was no longer focused on the paperwork in front of her. Her mind was racing, the pieces falling together in an instant, and she didn't care who saw the shock in her eyes. She stood frozen for a moment, then moved quickly toward the front of the courtroom, her voice barely a whisper but carrying an urgency that no one in the room could ignore. Those marks, Overwatch protocol, confirmed kills over 800 yards. The room went silent. Even Kowalski, who had been walking beside Elena, slowed his pace, glancing back toward Walsh, his brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't understand. No one else in the room did. They were just people, caught in their own stories, not knowing what to do with the revelation unfolding before them. Elena's true identity, the one she had hidden for so long, was now exposed. But for her, the world's reaction felt like a distant hum. As Walsh moved forward, her hand reached for her phone, already pulling up classified files she wasn't supposed to access. Elena, still walking with the same measured steps, didn't react. She didn't look up, didn't show any sign of recognition that her past had just been laid bare. It wasn't the first time her history had been exposed. In the world she had once lived in, secrets like hers had a way of slipping through the cracks. This was no different, except this time, the people around her were seeing what they had never been meant to understand. Walsh's voice was calm but filled with undeniable authority as she spoke. Again, I wrote intelligence summaries on these operations. Overwatch 7, Elena Briggs, she was killed in action in 2012. She paused, her breath catching as she looked back at Elena. Except she's standing right here. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, the truth settling heavily in her chest. Elena Briggs wasn't just a name in a report. She was a survivor, a hero, a ghost of a past the world hadn't been ready to face. Kowalski stood there, unsure of how to proceed. His hands were still gripping the cuffs in his pocket, his mind racing to make sense of what Walsh had said. He was no longer escorting a defendant. He was escorting someone who had been part of the most covert, dangerous missions in modern military history. But all he saw now was the same woman who had been brought in for a parking ticket. Someone who had been humiliated, degraded in front of everyone. The man who had so easily dismissed her as just another troublemaker suddenly felt the weight of his actions, the weight of the injustice he had been a part of. Elena didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply kept walking, her head held high, as if the world had just shifted beneath her feet. But she refused to be thrown off course. Her mind raced with memories of her days as a sniper, perched high above the chaos, watching over her team with the precision of a machine. But now, she wasn't in control of the situation. Now, she was just another person caught in the gears of the system. Walsh continued to speak, her voice a little stronger now. As she turned to face the room, Overwatch 7, she was part of Operation Copper Rain, Morab Province, Yemen, 2012. Elena Briggs was on a 6-story building with clear sightlines to 3 extraction points when it took a direct hit from an RPG. The building collapsed. We found her in the rubble 18 hours later, still alive, still conscious, still guiding her team through the extraction. Walsh's voice broke slightly as she finished the sentence. The weight of Elena's heroism and the fact that no one knew seeping into the words. Elena felt the shift in the room, but she didn't react. She could hear the murmurs of disbelief, the shock spreading like wildfire through the crowd. The judge, who had been droning on about parking fines and small claims cases, suddenly went silent, his eyes wide. The lawyers at the back of the room looked up, confused, as if trying to process what they had just heard. The room, once filled with the dull buzz of everyday bureaucracy, now felt suffocating, as if time had stopped and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the world to shift. Kowalski took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't a part of the world Elena had once belonged to. He didn't understand what it meant to be a part of that hidden world. But now, standing here in front of everyone, he could no longer ignore the fact that he had treated someone who had done more for this country than he ever would with disdain. He wasn't just escorting a criminal, he had been escorting a ghost. Elena didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of the room, the way they all looked at her now, some with respect, some with regret, was enough. The system had failed her. Yes, but now, the truth had come out. Now, they all knew who she really was. Walsh turned to the judge, her voice resolute. This is Elena Briggs, and she deserves respect, not humiliation. She saved lives more than any of you can ever imagine. The room fell into a stunned silence, the air thick with the weight of Elena's past. As Walsh finished speaking, Elena's sleeve fell back into place, hiding the marks once again. But the damage had been done. The world knew who she was now, and it would never be the same again. The courthouse doors burst open with a force that made everyone in the room turn their heads. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne stepped into the lobby, his presence so commanding that it seemed to change the very atmosphere. His uniform was pristine, the white dress blues crisp against the dull, institutional background. The rows of ribbons on his chest gleamed in the fluorescent light, each one a testament to decades of service, sacrifice, and battle. As he walked, the noise of the courthouse seemed to fade. Like the building itself recognized the weight of the man now standing in its midst. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even the judge, who had been presiding over Elena's case moments earlier, seemed to pause in his actions, his hand hovering over the gavel. Thorne's eyes scanned the room quickly, his gaze sharp. Taking in the scene with military precision, he didn't wait for anyone to speak. His voice, low and commanding, broke the stillness. Where is Elena Briggs?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. A clerk nervously looked up from behind the desk and gestured toward the holding area where Elena had been sitting just moments ago. Thorne's gaze shifted immediately to that direction, and his stride lengthened as he moved toward it. Behind him, 2 junior officers in crisp uniforms struggled to keep up, their pace diminished by the weight of their commanding officer's authority. As Thorne approached the holding area, his eyes locked on Elena, sitting still in the cold, sterile room. Her posture was as rigid as ever, her shoulders squared and her expression unreadable. When she saw him, there was a brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, but she said nothing. Elena had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words, especially when dealing with people who didn't want to hear your story. Thorne stopped just before her, his presence looming over her as if the entire room had shrunk to make space. For him, "Stand, Elena," he commanded gently, yet with the authority of someone who had given life and death orders without a second thought. Elena stood without hesitation, her hands still at her sides. He looked at her, his gaze softening for a brief moment before he turned to face the small gathering of courthouse staff, the lawyers, and the judge. This woman," Thorne began, his voice carrying through the room, "has served this country in ways you can't begin to comprehend. She is not some common criminal to be paraded around and humiliated. She is a hero, and she deserves more respect than you have shown her today." The room was still. The courthouse staff exchanged confused glances, their minds racing to catch up with what Thorne had just revealed. Elena, though, was already well acquainted with this kind of shock. It wasn't the first time her heroism had been reduced to a quiet, forgotten footnote. But something about the Admiral's words felt different this time. They weren't just empty platitudes. There was a weight behind them. A weight that came from a place deep inside Thorne, someone who had seen, firsthand, the cost of war. "Elena Briggs," Thorne continued, his voice growing stronger, was the lead sniper on Operation Copper Rain. She was stationed on a 6-story building in Marab Province, Yemen, in 2012, providing overwatch for a team of operators. When their extraction point was compromised and their mission was falling apart, Elena remained on that building, guiding 43 men to safety. Even after the building was hit by an RPG and collapsed around her, the last thing anyone heard from her was her voice on the radio, steady and calm, even as her own life was hanging by a thread. He paused for a moment, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The room was still, and everyone seemed to hold their breath as Thorne's words sank in. Elena had never asked for recognition. She didn't want the praise, nor did she need it. But standing there now, under the weight of Thorne's presence, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years' acknowledgement. Thorne's gaze swept over the people in the room, taking in their shocked expressions. "This woman," he said again, his voice gaining power, "saved lives that day. She was awarded the Navy Cross, an honor earned in complete silence, far away from the eyes of the world." He took a step forward, his voice hardening with the edge of a commander who had seen too much injustice in his life. "And you, the very system she fought to protect, have treated her like a criminal for a simple mistake. I won't let that stand." The judge, his face pale, cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral, we weren't aware of—" Thorne cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I don't care what you were aware of. I'm telling you now." He turned back to Elena, his expression softening. "Elena, I'm sorry. You should never have been put through this." Elena nodded once, but she didn't speak. Words had never been the tool she needed to fight this kind of battle. She had fought in silence, behind the scope of a rifle, far away from the spotlight. And now, standing in front of a room full of people who had no idea what she had truly done, she felt the weight of their ignorance and their sudden realization. Thorne's eyes moved back to the room, his gaze unwavering. "I want this proceeding dismissed," he commanded. "All charges dropped, all fines waived, and if any part of this appears in her record, I want it expunged by the end of the day." "Understood." The judge nodded quickly, his face flush with embarrassment. "Of course, Admiral, absolutely. It will be done." His voice trembled, and Elena could see the shift in him, the realization that he had made a mistake that could not be undone, a mistake that cost Elena her dignity. The room slowly began to stir as people moved about, whispering in low tones, processing the revelation. Elena felt a quiet weight lift from her shoulders, but she didn't allow herself to feel relief. Not yet. It was hard to feel relief when her past had been thrust into the light like this, when everything she had fought to keep buried was suddenly exposed. Thorne turned back to Elena, his expression a mixture of respect and quiet regret. "I'm going to ensure that you get what you need, Elena, but I need you to understand something. Heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like." Elena gave him a brief nod. She wasn't a hero. Not really. She was just a person who had done what she had to do, because that was the job. But standing there now, in the light of the Admiral's words, she couldn't help but feel the weight of everything she had done, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe. The courthouse was quieter now, the bustle of the earlier drama fading into the background as Elena made her way toward the exit. The heavy door swung open with a soft creak, and the cool morning air brushed against her face, the fresh scent of the ocean mixing with the distant hum of traffic. Her footsteps echoed in the empty lobby, the sound of her boots against the marble floor, a sharp reminder of everything. That had just happened. It was over now. Her case was dismissed. She had been cleared, but somehow, it felt like more than just a legal resolution. It felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, a burden that had been with her for far too long. As she passed the clerk's desk, the young woman looked up, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. Elena didn't meet her gaze at first, but the clerk stood up, a small card in her hand. I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything. For your service." She extended the card toward Elena, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. There was no grand gesture, no emotional exchange, just a small moment of connection. Elena nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the gesture, and tucked the card into her jacket pocket without a word. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the fog, the light spilling across the parking lot in soft, golden rays. Elena's car sat just where she had left it, the old Honda still running despite its years of wear. She slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel with familiar ease. The engine hummed quietly as she shifted into drive, pulling out of the parking lot without a second glance at the courthouse. It was behind her now, but she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of emptiness. The relief was there, yes, but so was something else, something she couldn't quite place. As she drove, the scenery shifted from the gray, industrial cityscape to the lush green hills of the countryside, the road winding through familiar, quiet stretches of farmland. Elena's gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, the soft rumble of the tires against the asphalt a constant companion. She had been driving for hours before, years ago, when the world felt more uncertain, more dangerous. But now, the quiet seemed like a luxury. The world outside her car was still, unhurried. It was the kind of stillness that filled the air around her, wrapping her in a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Her thoughts drifted back to the life she had left behind, the life of missions, deployments, and endless waiting. She had been a sniper, a quiet observer, always hidden in the shadows, watching over the chaos. Her past was something she didn't like to revisit, something she had buried deep within herself. The marks on her forearm were a reminder of that, a reminder of the lives she had taken and the lives she had saved. But it was a life she no longer wanted. She had walked away from it, chosen a quieter existence, far removed from the noise of the military, from the chaos of the world. Driving through the small towns, she passed rows of houses with picket fences, people out on their lawns, children playing in the streets. The life she had now was simple, quiet, and it suited her. There were no headlines here, no public recognition. The people she met along the way didn't know her past, and she preferred it that way. She had come to terms with who she was, or at least, she thought she had. But today, something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Elena allowed herself to acknowledge the life she had once lived, the person she had been, and the person she was becoming. The radio played softly in the background, the static cutting through as she neared the outskirts of town. The song that came through was an old country ballad, one she hadn't heard in years, but it reminded her of her childhood, of quieter days before everything had changed. She let the music fill the silence, letting her mind drift as the road stretched on before her. Elena's mind wandered to the young clerk from the courthouse. It had been such a small thing, a simple thank you, but it felt different somehow. It wasn't the recognition she had longed for, but it was real, a small moment of human connection, something she had not expected. The gesture made her feel seen, even if just for a second, in a way that no mission, no award, no praise had ever done. It was a small kindness, but it had weight. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to feel the warmth of it, before letting it go, as she always did. She pulled off the main highway and onto a smaller road that led to her home, a small, quiet property she had claimed for herself years ago. It was modest, far from anything glamorous, but it was hers. She had built it with her own hands, carved out a piece of peace in a world that had never offered her much. As she turned into the gravel driveway, she took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, clean air that always seemed to calm her. The house was exactly as she had left it. Nothing had changed. The small, weathered wooden cabin sat at the edge of a meadow, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees providing the only sound. Elena parked the car and sat for a moment, her hands still resting on the wheel, staring out at the view. The rolling hills, the trees, the sky, everything was just as she remembered. Peaceful, quiet, safe. It wasn't much, but it was everything she needed. No headlines, no accolades, just a quiet life. The life she had chosen, and that was enough. Elena finally stepped out of the car and made her way toward the house, her movements deliberate, as though savoring each step, each moment of the day. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, the world felt still, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with that.